Well, the merry-go-round is swinging again because it is time for another Championship Manager special this morning, and it's one for once I'm pretty well qualified to talk about because it's a manager who in his last job I watched about 75% of his games live in the flesh, and it's one that's been a bit of a badly kept secret over the last week or two. Because of course we are moving to the northeast and talking about Middlesbrough FC, who have appointed former Luton manager Rob Edwards as their head coach on a 3-year deal. Now interestingly, not just Rob Edwards announced this morning, also former Coventry City assistant manager Adi Viviash, who was obviously a key component under Mark Robins as they got within a kick of the Premier League a couple of years ago, losing to Luton in that playoff final, and Harry Watlin, who has a wealth of experience across English football too. So 3 people coming into Middlesbrough. We're going to talk about the new man in quite a lot of detail, the old man, and of course what's been happening in the last couple of years at Middlesbrough. Because for the second time in succession, Borough are going for a young, exciting, well thought of coach. Because if we go back to the last couple of seasons and the former head coach Michael Carrick, who of course, as has been mentioned a bit later on by Rob Edwards, was given time, and this is a club that does give time. In his 2.5 years in charge at Borough, had a very good start in the 22-23 season, having joined in the October. They flew up the division after a poor start and made it into the playoffs before losing to Coventry with Adi Viviash in the dugout, and then of course they were beaten by Luton in the playoff final. But based on that first sort of 7-8 months in charge, things were exciting at Borough. Everyone is expecting them to be a top 6 club again. And for the last couple of seasons, for whatever reason, that hasn't quite happened. And we're going to dive into it a little bit to try and work out where Rob Edwards is going to need to improve the club. Because actually last season, you look at the campaign and you think, well, a 10th place finish, a bit of a disappointing year, missed out on the playoffs by a few points. In the end, it was who didn't want it the least when it came to the Championship's 5th and 6th spot, because everyone was trying to throw it away at the end. And Borough really finished with a whimper after a decent start to the season. But there were so many games, it felt, when we were doing our weekly predictions, where Borough were dominating, having more of the ball, having more of the chances, and just not putting them away. And that combined with the fact that they lost Emmanuel Atilath in January, brought in what most people would have thought was a shoo-in for goals in Kelechi and Acho, just didn't work out. A couple of other players who were either injured, not in form for whatever reason, and Tommy Conway, who was a little bit hit and miss throughout the season, despite popping up with a decent number of goals. And it meant that Middlesbrough, despite being a joint 4th highest scorers in the division, weren't actually able to turn their dominance into the performances that was expected. And this is sort of signified by the XG table, which is something I hate using. I don't often refer to XG, but there is no doubt in Middlesbrough's case that overall during the season, they had been a fairly dominant force. On the XG table, they would have been second in the division overall. Their expected goals 0.2 higher than what they produced, and it does sort of reflect the fact that they weren't taking chances. Add to that they were conceding more than they should have, and there's a couple of reasons for that we'll talk about a bit later on. And you feel that Middlesbrough, actually, the underlying statistics and the underlying performances are not that bad. There's a little bit missing in both boxes, and there are a few areas where this club needs to improve. But for a manager coming in from Michael Carrick, you're taking over what is a pretty good squad and a pretty well-performing team that is just missing in those 2 key areas, which are the 2 boxes. I mean, if you look at Michael Carrick's record overall, it's actually very good. Nearly a 50% win rate. He's up at 46.32 over 136 games. Won nearly half of his matches in charge. They scored goals galore in the first season. Of course, you remember that 22-23 campaign. They had Chuba Akpom, they had Cameron Archer. They were putting in goals for fun. They've never really quite been able to replace them. Latilaf was maybe a slight step down, and they've just not been able to work out with other signings. So while relying on goals and creativity from midfield and generally creating chances in matches, Middlesbrough just haven't quite been able to hit the heights of that first season because they've not had that lethal goal scorer. And while the Championship was a little lower scoring last year, Middlesbrough missed so many chances and so many opportunities to be higher up the table. Much like Luton Town, that were the previous club the new head coach managed. We'll talk about that in a second. But overall, I think Middlesbrough are actually in an okay position. We'll talk a little bit more about where Rob Edwards can improve them later on. But let's first move on to the new man, Rob Edwards, and have a look at the statement that Middlesbrough have put out, because they said they're delighted to confirm him as head coach, joining on a 3-year deal with the two coaches we mentioned earlier on. Now, Rob brings a wealth of experience, having a Luton Town to the top flight during his first season at the club. Absolutely true. And followed that by managing the Hatters in the Premier League. Also won League Two with Forest Green and had a brief spell with Watford before, which we've talked about here before on the channel. Now, the head of football, Kieran Scott, talked about someone that he'd been aware of for a long time, followed his development, and the fact that he won promotion to the Premier League with Luton Town was a massive achievement. We are very much in agreement with that. It was one hell of a year, let me tell you that. Rob Edwards said he's delighted to be given the opportunity, big fan base, all the usual drivel, but also does allude to the fact that they have a brilliant owner who historically gives their coaches time. And that's something that after the Watford stint, I think Rob Edwards has been cautious of, both with Luton and now with Middlesbrough as well. So not a huge amount of detail and waffle in the statement, as we've seen with some of the others recently, Sheffield United and Hull being two examples of that. But this is a really difficult one for me as a Luton fan, because I have to talk about Rob Edwards in a balanced way, because he's given us probably the best day we've had in a generation, then a great year, but let's not shy away from what's happened after either. We're going to talk about both of these, because I was firmly Rob Edwards until the very end at Luton, but I need to be balanced, and I am going to have to bring out the criticisms as well, because otherwise I'd be accused of being biased. So let's have a look back at Rob Edwards, the manager, because we talked about the good jobs he'd done at Telford, at Forest Green in the lower leagues. No one gets judged on Watford now, because 10, 11 games and you're out the door. Obviously an FA man, done a lot of work with them back in the day as well. Managed England's under-16s briefly too. But let's talk about Luton Town and the era there, because Rob Edwards took over at a pretty difficult time for the club, because while it was a club on the up with a brilliant dressing room, a very set way of playing and a very effective culture in the club, Nathan Jones had left to go to Southampton. It was the Winter World Cup break in 2022, and taking over at a very similar time to Michael Carrick at Middlesbrough, he continued the momentum, which was a very hard thing to do. We saw the first time Nathan Jones left, we managed to continue the momentum and get promoted, and then it fell away with Graham Jones, where that didn't happen with Rob Edwards. That has to be said. He managed to continue, and he did one very sensible thing. He stuck with the style Luton were playing. He didn't try and adapt to play his way, which we've seen at Forest Green. They're a progressive side. They played out from the back. He developed that side into his mould. He didn't do that immediately at Luton Town. He played the way we were playing. He suited the players that we had in the team, played a formation, played a style of football that really he didn't want to do. And it was so effective. Luton were so good at the back. They were picking up very narrow victories. Time and time again, the 1-0 win at home. I mean, it's a very hard thing to explain. There's no better feeling as a football fan for all of the exciting football. When you go to a home match, you score a goal and you think, we've won the game. It's a very, very unique luxury to have. Obviously went away in the Premier League, which we'll get to in a moment. But in the end, at Wembley, proved the brilliance in the coaching team, the amount of work rehearsing on penalties. It was no fluke that every Luton penalty was scored in that shootout, and was scored with a lot of confidence as well. Obviously dealt on the day with the situation regarding Tom Lockyer and the collapse, and obviously has dealt with that situation brilliantly since as well. And one of the things that came across throughout that period is Rob Edwards, not the football manager, but more the human being, and someone that is always going to have the respect and the support of the players, which I still think he did till the end at Luton, to be fair to him. Our home form, even up until his sacking, was pretty good. However, we move on to the Premier League campaign, and Luton have to play in a very different way. It started with trying to be a bit more solid, trying to avoid conceding goals, and in the end we were losing games with a whimper and not really having a go. And he just flicked the switch in December, and we became this attacking, aggressive side who would just attack teams and try and outscore them. People will remember the famous 4-3 at home to Arsenal. They'll remember lots of other big games as well, where we just went and had a go. We ran City close. We went 3 up at Bournemouth and then lost 4-3. Key moments. But there were so many big, exciting games there, and Luton played in a way where Premier League teams didn't really know how to deal with them at times. And of the last 6 that have come up, a lot has been made of the 3 going up and back down. Luton were the only ones that really had a chance with 2 or 3 games to go. And that, I think, speaks volumes given the budgets and that in the way that we were playing. So Rob Edwards keeping the culture in the dressing room, improving players, something he's proven he can do. The renaissance of Ross Barkley, but also the improvement of several championship players to step up and become effective and have good statistics and good contributions at Premier League level certainly stands him in good stead. But in the end, it was a relegation for Luton Town, despite going on the longest scoring streak in the Premier League that season, something that was sadly missed this year with a lack of goals in the top two flights. But Luton Town did come down to the Championship, and this is where I maybe have to go against my support for Rob Edwards and give the fair criticisms, because while recruitment in that summer wasn't good for Luton Town, Rob Edwards made his own mistakes as well. There were a lot of mistakes off the pitch, but on it, Rob Edwards tried to completely change our style and build a Luton side at the start of this season in the mould of his previous teams, the Forest Greens, etc., playing out from the back, a slower tempo, etc., and trying to dominate the game with the ball. However, didn't have the players for it, didn't make the adjustments. We were still playing with these two big target men up front. We were still playing with a crippled defence and lots of wing-backs tucking in at centre-half, etc. But we ended up in a position sort of in the early weeks of the season where we were conceding goals on the counter at will because we were playing this high line, this high pressing system with full-backs and the few slow centre-halves that were left available. And we also had two big target men up front where we were trying to play intricate football in the centre of the park. And as a result, they weren't really getting any chances. So you do then have to question that at the one point Rob Edwards tried to adapt Luton into his own style and his own mould as a team. I mean, let's be honest, it completely fell apart. It was a catastrophe. And obviously, in the end, he left the club in January just outside the relegation zone. Luton Town went on to be relegated, and the rest is history. We're now a League One club 2 years after being in the Premier League. But that would be my only criticism and my worry for Rob Edwards, was trying to change too much too soon after relegation without having the adjustments and the players to do it. And something that he did so well 18 months earlier, whether it was the whole club as a sort of ego and a confidence thing, thinking they could do it and do it well because they'd been in the Premier League. But he did try to change the club to his style very quickly last summer, and almost suddenly after a year and a half of playing the Luton Town way of recent seasons. And it fell apart massively, obviously culminating in a Luton relegation and Rob Edwards sacking after a terrible half a year. So his underlying statistics at Luton look okay, a 30% win rate, but obviously in there you've got a promotion, you've got a Premier League relegation where the win rate was never going to be good. But Luton had a go, which a lot of the other clubs that have gone up recently have not managed to do. And when we see from the same season, say a Burnley, it proves that you don't have to play one way to try and survive. But how does that adapt to Middlesbrough? Because this is my big worry when it comes to the Middlesbrough job, because we talked earlier on in the episode about Middlesbrough really struggling to convert chances and underperforming in their expected goals. They're one of the few sides in the Championship last season that scored less goals at home than they did away from home. And one of the things we saw earlier this season with Luton Town was teams were able to frustrate. They would sit behind the ball, they would sit deep, they would wait to hit on the counter against our defence, and it was slower and wasn't able to cope with that system. And that led to a lot of poor results. That led to us going behind in a lot of games. And then when you're behind against teams that are sitting behind the ball, it becomes virtually impossible against most teams. Now, this is my worry for Middlesbrough, because if they tries to play that same style with the players that are there, and with Middlesbrough probably being very good between the two boxes and having a slight deficiency at both ends of the pitch, is that going to lead to the same outcome? Now, you would hope with experienced coaches behind him, and with the fact that you would assume Middlesbrough are going to invest a little, knowing where their weaknesses are, particularly with Latiaf moving on in January. They obviously brought in quick solutions, trying to get Iheanacho and that on loan last year. I think we'll see something different this summer and continued work throughout the window. But given what I perceive to be a weakness in goal with Seny Dieng, who statistically does make a few errors, never really looks convincing, is capable of the sublime, but he's not consistent enough for a top goalkeeper in my view. I feel like Middlesbrough, for this to work with Rob Edwards, are going to have to improve in both boxes and are going to have to get a team that fits into his mould. Now, there's no doubt that this Middlesbrough team is closer to it than the Luton Town team he inherited before. And while in the Premier League in particular, he did sign some of those players at Luton, the likes of Lokonga and Barkley in midfield being examples, we also saw the other side last summer where he wasn't able to get in those players. And while I think Middlesbrough have got more of those creative types in midfield, the type of team that will suit him, I do worry about both boxes still. I worry about that high line with the defenders that are available to Borough at the moment. And is that backing and investment going to be there behind him? You would imagine it is after a couple of poor years to say these are the steps we're going to take. And the reason it's maybe taken a week or two longer than we thought to get this deal done. But ultimately, Middlesbrough have got to turn those home draws into victories, get themselves up the home form table. Even if they turn a couple of those 6 draws or 6 defeats into victories, they've been in a very different position and they don't concede that many goals at home. They're just lacking that ruthless edge. On the road, it's a slightly different story, losing 12 of their 23 away games, albeit their away record wasn't terrible. They were scoring goals for fun, only one behind Burnley and Leeds in terms of away goals this season, but they were conceding goals as well. And in that top end of the table, while Sheffield Wednesday had a great away record and a few poor results, Middlesbrough conceded the most. So I do worry about those two elements, having watched the Luton team a lot under Rob Edwards. Is he going to be able to sign defensive players with the pace and with the acumen on the ball to play the way he wants to play? Is there going to be a change in goal? I've said it for a long time. I don't think Seny Dieng is the answer. And more importantly, can Middlesbrough find the goals they had in a team 3 years ago? Because ultimately that's what cost Michael Carrick. Not being able to replace the goals of Akpom and Archer has been the reason they haven't made the playoffs the last 2 years. While the underlying performances are good, while the midfield players are still creating opportunities, there isn't that ruthless edge in front of goal. And I think that is the thing that Middlesbrough have to resolve more than any next year if they're to challenge for the top 6. But at this point of the episode, we normally talk about the 2 big questions. Will the manager see out his contract? And how will the club do next season? Now, we've kind of talked about this with a lot of the recent appointments. There's not much manager experience in the Championship, and Rob Edwards actually falls into that category as well. 11 games for Watford and 2 half seasons with Luton. Is actually one of the most experienced Championship managers that's been appointed this summer. We talk about Ryan Mason, who's had none at all at West Brom. Norwich, probably the exception with Liam Manning, but then you look at Southampton have gone for Will Still, never managed in England before. Same for Watford, same for other clubs as well that we've talked about recently. Gerhard Struber coming back for Bristol City, only had a spell with Barnsley for a year. So there's not a lot of Championship manager experience at the top, and I think we're going to see that the clubs that are more settled and haven't gambled may succeed more. As we saw in the relegation battle last year, the clubs that went for Championship experience were the ones that pulled well away from danger, and the clubs that didn't, such as Hull, Luton, Plymouth and Cardiff, were the ones that ended up in the bottom 4. So I think this is going to be a potentially shrewd appointment, but it has to be backed in a transfer window because there are deficits in that Middlesbrough squad for the way Rob Edwards will want to play. And of course, there's the glaring omission in front of goal, which cost Michael Carrick, despite the fact the club generally were performing well and were dominating games, but weren't able to take their chances. So I think for Middlesbrough next year, a top 6 challenge is definitely on. Even the last 2 seasons, they've been in and around that mix. However, as I've said with a couple of the others, recruitment is going to be key. There are clubs that finished above Middlesbrough last year that you would expect to have slightly smaller budgets on paper. Middlesbrough obviously have got a little bit of money in from the January window, which can be reinvested. And they've got an opportunity this year with sides coming down that have gambled or in disarray. You've not got Leeds who have stuck with Daniel Farker because Sheffield United have gambled on a manager with half a season of Championship experience. You've got Ipswich coming down. Who knows what's going to happen with them? Leicester don't seem to know what's going on. There's charges off the pitch. Ruud van Nistelrooy, the situation has been uncertain all summer. And then so many of the other clubs in that playoff mix where we've talked about them gambling when it comes to managers this year. So there is going to be an opportunity for clubs to break in if they can get a strong start. And Rob Edwards is someone who will command the respect of the players, is a very good human being, will get the fans on side, will obviously speak incredibly well and with great clarity, which will help the fan base too. However, there's got to be backing in the transfer window in those key areas in both boxes. And there's going to have to be a little bit of compromise because hopefully what Rob Edwards saw last season at Luton Town is that you can't just go all in 100% for your way of playing. Generally speaking, Burnley exception a couple of years ago, you cannot go up from the Championship playing pretty football for 46 games. You have to slog it out at times. And I think Middlesbrough are going to require a little bit of compromise. And maybe for Rob Edwards, somewhere in between the 2 Championship styles he had with Luton Town. Seeing out the 3 years, more than most clubs, this is an opportunity, isn't it? You would imagine that if he does really well, he's a young coach that's led Luton to the Premier League. If he's flying with Borough, they may be interested in him again. But ultimately, I feel he's landed on his feet in this job because Middlesbrough are another club that will provide stability off the pitch like Luton Town and will provide him with time. It's just whether he can adapt to the players that he's going to be working with. And maybe if the recruitment isn't as perfect as he'd like it to be, that they can find a way to get results rather than crumble as Luton did last year. Having said that, I think Middlesbrough have got a strong squad. I think Rob Edwards is a very good coach. And as I said before, I was Rob Edwards into the end with Luton Town, and I think we would have stayed up with him in charge. We still had a decent home record, and for Borough, that's what they're going to need next year. It doesn't really matter what I think, though, does it? I've given you my view on Rob Edwards, having watched most of his games live for a 2.5-year period with Luton Town. I've given you my view on what he needs to improve at Middlesbrough. But Borough fans, how do you feel about this appointment? Are you excited? Are you apprehensive? Do you think that you should have kept Michael Carrick? What do you think? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments below. Do you agree with my assessment that it is just the conversion of chances and the performances weren't terrible? Or are those defensive frailties and the problem at the other box going to be the issues for Borough again this year? Let us know your thoughts on that. If you're another Championship fan, what do you think? Will this make Borough stronger or weaker next season? Will it push them back into the top 6? I think there's a chance, but it's going to depend on a couple of other clubs who may be able to spring a surprise. But if you enjoyed this little introduction to Rob Edwards at Middlesbrough FC, then please do put a thumbs up on the video. If you want to stay up to date with all the rest of the Championship Manager specials this summer, subscribe, turn that notification bell on, and check out the playlist in the eye above where there have been plenty already over the off-season. We'll also be back in just a month or so's time with a new season of Championship predictions. We'll do our pre-season predictions a week or so before the season, and then we will have score predictions every single match week throughout the 25-26 campaign as always. Of course, I'm going to be watching League One football for the majority of this season, so you're going to get the chance to beat me this year. But come and get involved in all of that. Thank you so much for watching as always. Middlesbrough have appointed Rob Edwards as their head coach on a 3-year deal. Let us know what you think, and I'll see you again soon for another manager special.